Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're tackling something I find super interesting, and I know a lot of you do too. It's the connection between autism and dyscalculia.
It's a fascinating area and honestly one that's often misunderstood.
Absolutely. So
Hmm.
to really dig into this, we've got this article, Autism and Dyscalculia, a common co-occurrence. And right off the bat, it's highlighting something pretty striking. It's saying that dyscalculia, which is basically when someone has a tough time with math, pops up in people with autism way more than you'd expect.
It's definitely more than just a coincidence, and while we don't have all the answers just yet, the research points to a whole bunch of overlapping factors that might be at play here.
Okay, overlapping factors. Like what? Give us the rundown. What's the connection?
Well, one big one that comes up a lot is executive function.
Executive function.
Hmm.
For those of us who aren't brain scientists, what does that even mean?
It sounds way more complicated than it is. Basically, it's all those mental processes that help us stay organized, plan things out, manage our time. It's like the brain's control center, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture.
But here's the thing. For people with autism or dyscalculia, that control center, it might not always be working at 100%. It can be like trying to direct traffic during rush hour. Things can get a little backed up.
So it's not just about knowing the math itself. It's about having the brain power to organize those thoughts, break down problems, stay focused on the task at hand.
Exactly. And when those executive function skills are a bit shaky, it can make even simple math tasks feel super overwhelming.
Yeah, I can see how that would make someone feel anxious about even starting a math problem in the first place. It's like that feeling of being lost in a new city without a map. It's overwhelming.
And that actually leads perfectly into another overlapping factor the article talks about: sensory processing. A lot of people on the autism spectrum experience the world in a different way, and that includes sensory input sites, sounds, smells, textures, dot even numbers.
So it's not just the math itself.
Mm.
It's the entire experience of learning and doing math that can be tricky, like fluorescent lights buzzing, pencils scratching on paper. Things that others might tune out could be super distracting.
Right. It's like trying to have a conversation at a rock concert. Your brain's working overtime just to process everything that's coming at it.
Makes total sense. So we've got these executive function challenges, we've got sensory processing differences. Anything else in the mix that might explain why autism and dyscalculia seem to show up together so often?
You're good at this. You're basically summarizing the article perfectly. But yes, there's more. The article also talks about how both autism and dyscalculia can make it trickier to grasp abstract ideas.
Oh, abstract thinking. Tell me about it. Math was never my strong suit, and I imagine it's a whole other ballgame when you factor in those additional challenges.
Imagine trying to explain the concept of time to someone who's never experienced it. It's an idea, not something you can physically touch or see. That's the thing with abstract concepts. They require a different kind of thinking.
Mind blown. Seriously, that's a fantastic way to explain it. And without that grasp of abstract thinking, those fundamental math concepts like what's a fraction even representing must seem impossible.
It can be incredibly frustrating. And it doesn't stop there. Let's add another layer to this complex cake: genetics.
Okay, genetics. So maybe a predisposition to these conditions runs in families. Is that what you mean?
It's not quite as simple as saying this one gene equals dyscalculia, but there's definitely growing evidence that genetics might play a role in both conditions. Think of it like this.
Hit me with your best analogy.
Imagine you've got a garden. Genes are like the soil. They provide the foundation, the potential for certain plants to grow. But it's the environment, the sunlight, the water, the care it receives that ultimately determines if those plants will thrive or struggle. So genes might make someone more susceptible, but it's often those environmental factors that tip the scales.
Wow, okay. So it's not just one thing, it's a whole bunch of factors at play here. Genes might set the stage, but it's the interplay of brain development, environment, and those unique challenges with executive function, sensory processing, and abstract thinking that really create the whole picture.
Exactly. And understanding those pieces, those individual ingredients, is key to providing the right kind of support.
Okay, so let's talk about support, because that's what I really want to dig into. How do we help? If someone's showing signs of both autism and dyscalculia, what should people be looking out for specifically?
Yeah, tell me about it. It's one thing to read about it in an article, but how do you actually know if this is something that's going on for someone? What should parents, teachers, maybe even friends be on the lookout for? That's the million-dollar question, right? And the article does a good job of laying out some of the red flags, or maybe I should say warning numbers. First of all, those basic math facts. Even with tons of practice, they just might not stick.
So addition, subtraction, knowing your multiplication tables, the stuff we usually think of as the building blocks.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just memorization, too. It's like they might be able to parrot back the answer, but they're not really grasping the underlying concept, which makes it almost impossible to actually apply that knowledge.
Oh, so it's like you can memorize that 3 times 4 is 12, but if you don't get the idea of what multiplication is actually doing, you're going to hit a wall pretty quickly.
And that wall will probably show up around the same time they start learning about fractions or decimals.
Which, let's be honest, are tough even for people who don't have these challenges.
You're telling me. And those broader mathematical concepts can be a real sticking point. It's almost like they need to take an extra step, translate that abstract idea into something more concrete and relatable.
That reminds me of a time I was trying to learn a new language, and I was really struggling with the grammar until I started connecting it back to English grammar rules. Once I had that familiar reference point, it kind of clicked. Maybe it's like that for math, too. It's about finding those bridges that connect to a student's existing understanding.
That's such a great point. Finding those bridges, creating those connections, that's where good teaching can really make a difference. And, it's not just about the numbers themselves. The article also talks about spatial reasoning, which can be a big challenge.
Okay. Spatial reasoning, Doc. Break that down for me. What does that even mean in a math context?
So spatial reasoning is all about understanding where things are in space, how they relate to each other. In math, that might look like having trouble visualizing how shapes fit together or struggling with geometry.
Ah, I see. So, like if someone's trying to rearrange furniture in their room, but they can't quite picture how it'll all fit, that could be a sign.
Exactly. Or if
Yeah.
they're always getting lost, even in familiar places, that could be related too.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so we've got struggling with those foundational math facts,
Hmm?
maybe having a tough time with spatial concepts. What about word problems? I feel like those are universally dreaded, but I can only imagine they're even trickier when you add in these other challenges.
Don't even get me started on word problems. I mean, for someone who's already struggling with abstract thinking, and maybe they have some language processing differences too, which is also common in autism.
It's like adding another layer of difficulty onto something that's already hard.
Exactly. It's like they're not only trying to do the math, but they're also trying to decipher this secret code just to figure out what the question is even asking in the first place. It's a lot.
It's no wonder that math anxiety is a thing.
Oh, big time. And the article really highlights how common that is for people with both autism and dyscalculia. All those challenges we've talked about. They can create this perfect storm of stress and avoidance.
Which makes it even harder to learn, right? It becomes this vicious cycle. Okay, so we've talked about some of the signs, which is so important for early identification.
Yeah.
But what happens next? How do you actually support someone who's dealing with both of these conditions?
That's the question, isn't it? And thankfully, there are a lot of things that can be done. But the article is really clear about this. It all starts with getting a clear diagnosis.
Okay, so diagnosis first.
Yeah.
But like we said before, it can be tricky because those symptoms sometimes overlap, right?
It's like a puzzle, for sure. And it often takes a team effort to put all those pieces together. Parents, teachers, therapists, maybe even an educational psychologist, they can all bring valuable perspectives to the table.
It really does. And a good team can figure out exactly what's going on and what kind of support will be most helpful. So once you have that diagnosis, what are some of the best ways to support someone with both autism and dyscalculia?
Well, the great news is that there are tons of strategies, and a lot of them can be tailored to each person's strengths and needs.
So it's not one size fits all. It's about figuring out what works for that individual.
Exactly. And one thing the article really emphasized is the importance of specialized math instruction. So rather than that traditional approach where everyone's learning the same thing at the same pace.
Which, let's be real, doesn't work for a lot of kids, even those without learning differences.
Exactly. It's about slowing things down, breaking down those concepts into smaller steps, using visual aids, hands-on activities, whatever it takes to make those abstract ideas more concrete and accessible.
Ah, so it's about making math something you can see and feel, not just this theoretical thing on a worksheet.
Right, like instead of just talking about fractions, imagine letting kids cut up fruit or use building blocks to actually see how those parts relate to the whole.
Oh, that's a fantastic idea.
Yeah,
Much more engaging than just staring at numbers on a page.
way more engaging. And for some kids, it might be helpful to incorporate those manipulatives, like you said, blocks, beads, things they can touch and move around to help them visualize those mathematical operations.
I'm getting flashbacks to using those colorful blocks in elementary school. I loved those things.
They work. And speaking of things that work, we can't forget about technology.
Oh, yeah. It's come a long way from the days of those clunky calculators.
Seriously. Now we have interactive math software, educational apps that feel like video games, even assistive technology that can read those word problems out loud for kids who struggle with reading comprehension.
I love that turning learning into a game. That's brilliant.
It makes a huge difference. And it's not just about the tools themselves, but about creating a supportive and understanding learning environment.
What does that look like in a classroom setting?
Well, it might mean providing extra time on tests or quizzes, allowing the use of those manipulatives we talked about, even just making sure the testing environment is quiet and free from distractions.
So minimizing those sensory overload situations that can make it so hard to focus.
Exactly. And on that note, it's crucial to remember the emotional side of all this. We talked about how common anxiety is for people with autism and dyscalculia, so addressing that is just as important as those academic strategies.
So it's not just about teaching the math skills, but also giving kids the tools to cope with those feelings of stress and overwhelm.
Exactly. And that's where things like cognitive behavioral therapy can be super helpful.
Okay, so what is cognitive behavioral therapy exactly? I hear that term a lot, but how does it actually work?
It basically helps people identify and change those negative thought patterns and behaviors. So instead of thinking, I'm terrible at math, a therapist might help a student reframe that to, math is challenging for me, but I can ask for help in practice and I can get better.
It's like giving them a new script to follow when those negative thoughts start creeping in.
Exactly. And just as important as those individual coping strategies is having a supportive network in place.
Parents, teachers, classmates.
Everyone. When kids feel understood and supported, they're more likely to take risks, ask for help, and ultimately succeed.
This has been an amazing conversation. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm sure our listeners have too. It's clear that we need to be having these conversations, raising awareness, and fighting for those individualized supports.
I couldn't agree more. Every brain is different, every learner is unique, and it's about time our education system caught up to that.
Preach. Okay, so for those listening, here's something I want you to think about. We've talked a lot about challenges, but where do those challenges intersect with strengths? Could those same traits that make math difficult also be the key to unlocking other talents and abilities? It's something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into autism and dyscalculia. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.